I'm Greg Parks, your host this morning for Who's Who. It's the first Thursday of the month, and the first Thursday of the month is the day for Who's Who. Just like the last Friday in the month is for exploring history. And we have the host or the expert here on exploring history today for our Who's Who program. All of you know Jane Curtis, or most of you do, because you've watched her on the Exploring History program for the last almost 10 years. It'll be 10 years in August. And she's very faithfully shown up every Friday, or the last Friday of every month, and told us about something that's been sort of extraordinary, because she's told us about things as diverse as Outer Mongolia, or American Indian women, or hieroglyphics, or ancient music. Whoa, whatever the subject might be, Jane's going to have something to talk about. And so today we're going to discuss some of her activities and learn a little bit more about her early life. So, Jane, thank you very much for coming on the program.
Good morning, Gray.
I appreciate it, and you know, I've looked forward to this for some time. I've really looked forward to having you on Who's Who.
Oh, thank you.
So let's talk first about your immediate, your early family, your parents and your siblings and so forth. Could you tell us a little bit about where you grew up? And
well, Illinois. I am a native of Illinois. I had two older brothers, much older than I, and my parents were, my mother was an electrical engineer, and my mother didn't work most of her life. She also taught, but my mother was a mathematician.
Oh.
And so
had she had training in math, or she was just natural?
Well, both.
Yeah.
She had some training, but she didn't take a lot of advanced education because of her health. Yeah. She had a few years of very poor health, but then she survived and lived to be within 2 months of 99. So, but no, the family, my brothers are both gone at this point. Yeah. But they were interesting people too, and we.
Oh, what did they do?
Got along well. The oldest one was a lawyer. Okay. And the other one was a math professor.
A math professor, okay.
So
college or high school or?
College, Illinois. What was it called? Illinois State Campus at Chicago, or whatever. Okay. Was.
So you have sort of probably a gift for math also, would be my guess.
I'm somewhere in the middle on math.
Yeah.
I like it. I wasn't quite as instinctive as my mother was at it. I've gotten much better. The computer helps that.
Yeah.
You know, I think it helps train your mind, as does music, of course.
Sure.
So I used to compare things with music, and then I see the way clearly a lot better with the way music works. But music, of course, gets you into physics as well if you really look at it. And it's magic, but yet it has this wonderful scientific.
Well, what about your any stories about your early elementary school or high school that you would like to relate?
Oh, I don't think so. In grammar school, I used to write poetry.
Oh.
And the teachers were always thrilled, of course. There's something else to do with the class. So I remember writing one year, and I believe it was the third grade, on Abraham Lincoln. So some Lincoln's birthday thing, and the music teacher set it to music, and that was all big time stuff. But
so it's a song you've written. It's set to music, and maybe I could do it for Abraham Lincoln's birthday someday. You know?
Well, I don't have it anymore. See, it was just a poem, my little childish poem. It rhymed and everything.
Good.
But I'm sure my mother must have kept a copy of it, but I never.
But you never got it.
But I remembered the episode.
What about high school?
Well, high school went by in a flash. That was fascinating. I had some very close friends there. We did a lot of interesting things. I don't really think there's anything striking to mention. When my mother was in high school, however, I was second in line in the class in rank. I was the valedictorian. But I would say my mother was first. My mother was valedictorian. And in those days in Chicago, William Randolph Hearst was a big name, and he had a program going where he took the seniors, every valedictorian from all the high schools in Chicago, and sent them to Washington for a week's trip, all expenses paid. And my mother, of course, went on that trip, and she left a wonderful account of it, sort of like a diary, the train ride in those days. And now they had to get off to eat meals. and there was no serving on the train then.
And this was,
But
of
mother,
course, before she was married, since this was high
yeah,
school.
no, she was high school.
Yeah.
She was just a senior in high school.
And she was from Illinois also?
Illinois, in Chicago,
yeah, okay.
yes. She had come from Chicago. I'll tell you about her ancestry in a minute because it's interesting.
Oh, okay. What about you have some interesting things on your ancestry?
But the rest of that story, in Washington, McKinley was president, and not long before he was assassinated, and they had a reception for all these little high school kids, and my mother actually shook the hand of McKinley, and he pat her on the head or something. So it was interesting. But ancestry is terribly interesting.
Yeah.
And I had my DNA taken a few years ago.
Oh.
And I was expecting 90% Northern European or something like that.
Northern European.
It came out less than half was that, and the other was divided between Southern European and Southwestern Asia. And this, of course,
Southwest Asia. So
this goes clear back.
Southwest Asia.
The DNA reflects things that have happened ever since, I guess, the Homo sapiens.
I was thinking the Mongolian influence coming in.
No, well, Southwestern. Of course, there were Mongols occupying that at one point. But no, it was an interesting thing. But my mother's mother was Austro-Hungarian.
Okay.
She was brought to this country as a child. But my mother had a Hungarian uncle, and her grandfather was something else. Her mother's maiden name was Slavic, so there were some Slavs in the mix.
Yeah.
A terrific mixture. And she married 100% Saxon. My grandfather was a good old square-head Saxon German. But very, I remember him she died, I never knew her, but I knew him slightly. But on my father's side, just about 100% American, about as 100% as you can get. And Huguenot as well.
Oh.
His mother was Huguenot extraction, but his mother was the daughter of an immigrant from Scotland, and this immigrant from Scotland was from the Huguenot line. It was refugees from the Huguenots, the ones who had gone to Scotland.
Oh, okay.
So here's this wonderful mixture, all mixed up.
Well, the interesting thing about it, as you go back, you've got your line that's your dad's name because you can check that very easily, but it's the grandmothers that's often the interesting thing because they might be almost. I have my grandmother's Dutch, but the Parks line goes all the way back through to Northern Ireland, but that's only 1600. What happened in 500 AD? Because we descend from somebody in 500 AD, not just somebody, but a host of people. So
the whole world,
it's not surprising that we have our DNA shows so many different cultures.
It is. It's amazing.
Yeah. Well, what about you went to college? Where did you go to college? What did you study there?
I went to Wellesley.
Wellesley. Oh, up in, let's see, that's in
Massachusetts, yeah.
How did you get over there?
Well, I was thinking of going west maybe, because as a child I liked the West. We had a branch family in Colorado, and I liked it. But the high school dean said, no, you want to go east. And they pulled strings and did things. But in any rate, I had such a good record, there was no trouble getting a scholarship. So I did. And I was thinking of majoring in either astronomy or geology. The geology is wonderful up in Massachusetts. You can drive around and, But I wound up in the political science department and languages.
Oh.
And figured
so that's
that
where you
would be
first
good.
you got an interest in languages, or did you have an interest in languages before?
No, I had one before.
Oh, okay.
But that one just fed it because everybody's heard of Nabokov. And Nabokov and his wife were living in Cambridge at the time, and they were teaching at Harvard. His health was still very poor. They had suffered badly in the war. They had refugeed out of Russia as very young people. And they had then had to refugee out of Germany, and then finally came over here. But in fact, she did the class much of the time. But they were aristocrats, from St. Petersburg, and very interesting, but just as approachable. I mean, just as nice as you could want. But Nabokov taught us. He was not a good teacher in the conventional sense of the term. But his Russian class was, now I briefed during summer, I learned the alphabet, some small words.
That's not an easy thing to do.
So I could, really get going, hit the ground running, as they say. But he would get off onto wonderful tangents, and we met in a room that was kind of abstract. And he was a butterfly expert as well. And I remember one day in class, this butterfly came in the window, and he paused, and he used to hold his head back and kind of speak down this way, and he'd slouch around a little bit, and he always looked a little bit coattails flying. But there was this butterfly. He saw the butterfly, and he went up to it, very adeptly caught it, not harming it, caught it, identified what it was, slouched over to the window and let it go. I could see him yet. But that was such an interesting experience. But we were, I did take some astronomy and geology courses there, and they were also very interesting.
Well, Wellesley is a liberal arts college, right? It's fairly broad and lots of. Okay.
It is.
Well, after Wellesley, did you start a career or what?
Yes. Well, I had this happy but too short experience with marriage somewhere along the line, but yes. So I went into I wanted to do something using the languages, and I wanted to get around.
Now you say languages, specific language, or do you?
Well, the good languages I had at the time. My French was very, very good.
French.
And my German had not been polished much because I had just sort of learned that, exchanging word with my grandfather now and then. But the Russian was good and growing. So in traveling around, in fact, I fell in with a group of Russian emigres at one point, and the Russian got very good at that point. Yeah. It's somewhat fallen off now. I can still read it all right. But, and the French, so I was able to get a job. And my friend was, my closest friend was coming to Washington. She wanted to get into the Navy. She wanted to be a Navy officer.
Oh, Navy officer.
So she said, go to Washington with me. She said, I'm going to go to the Navy Department and apply. Go, just apply to something. So I went around. I applied, I applied to state, and I applied to Army and something else. But Army grabbed me right away. Oh. They said, would you like to be an Army civilian? And I said, well, maybe. What is involved? And we want to send you to Japan, because I'd also gotten into analysis. Yeah. And I think maybe the music helps with that. Yeah. I turned out to be a very good analyst. Analyst. Yeah. And the Army liked the combination of language.
So when were you in Japan? This was after the war?
Yes. Yeah. I was in Japan in the 50s.
50s, yeah.
Early and mid-50s, and then a couple of other places in Southeast Asia that I was sent around. So that was broadening education, and so interesting. In light of what's happened later, Indonesia, for example, I spent several months there. You can relate to it so much better. Yeah. And it colors your whole life. It broadens your taste, I think. It makes you understand other people better.
Especially when you've lived there. Visiting a place is one thing, but living there is a whole different...
and you meet local people.
That's right. Learn local culture, local customs. And
if you travel around, now most of the time, if I could, I would travel by myself, because that's the way you meet local people. Yeah. And that wasn't always possible, sometimes.
So you've traveled extensively throughout the Far East and Europe too, I presume.
Not so much in the Middle East, but in Europe and the Far East, quite a lot, and not in South America. That somehow never lured me to go to South America.
You've never been there then, right?
No,
I haven't either.
No?
Okay. So your career then? How long were you in the Army? You were on the Army staff. How long were you? Department of Army Civilian.
Must have been about. Oh, wait a minute, because I did leave them at one point. I had a chance with the department, State Department, and in all it was over 30 years. Oh dear, I'm sorry, there goes my voice. It was over 30 years, so I was probably Army for 20 gosh, 24, 25, something like that.
Oh, okay. So that was your your career was then it was as a Department of Army civilian, and for different departments, I presume. And
Yes.
yeah.
You also get an insight into travel and doing the different things like that. You get an insight into other people and the problems of military personnel, for example, or the joys of associating with them or whatever. It makes you interested in everything, and you're always curious.
Good.
About.
All right. So when you left the Department of Army, did you do some other?
Well, that was when I had a tour with the Department of State.
State. Okay.
Yeah.
And how long was that?
That was 2 or 3 years.
What did you do there?
Excuse me, I did pretty much the same thing. They knew I was an analyst and a linguist, and they all kinds of reporting, as you probably well know, in the background. It's not just people going out and being charming at receptions and things like that. There's a lot of background work and a lot of local research type things and associating with keeping abreast of things.
Yeah. Did you do any graduate work?
Yes.
Oh.
I did. I went to Catholic University.
When was this?
That was somewhat later than that I decided I would get a PhD.
70s, 60s, 70s? Or?
70s and up there. I wanted a credential. I decided I'd leave official service like that and go into just freelance translating, because I was also interested in literary translating.
Oh, okay.
And when you tackle something like a Rilke poem, your analysis training helps, and of course your language has to be there. Meanwhile, my German gotten very good because I lived in Germany and Austria for several years. As
a Department of Army civilian? For the Army?
Yes,
yeah.
For the Army. And I'm trying to think which was when, and then later.
I'm just trying to keep the thread going.
No, and then later on my own.
Okay.
But yeah, I am too. When I think back, it's hard sometimes. When you're lucky, 91 years, you can remember a lot. My first memory, I was 3 years old, so that covers a lot of
You
territory.
remember 2 years old?
3 years old.
3 years old.
I just turned 3.
Yeah.
And I probably remember we were living in near Chicago, and a day on Lake Michigan, one of those lake steamer things where you could go for a day. And you always got a small cabin for the day, and then you went out and you went around the lake in different places. But my mother said I was plunked on the top of a double-decker bunk in this cabin, and I can remember that a long slit of a cabin, and it had a porthole at the end. The 2 bunks were here. There was a little bathroom, just big enough to get into there, and then this long room, and somebody had put a thermos of hot coffee up there, and it wasn't tightly enough, or leaked somehow. But anyway, it tipped over, and it burnt my leg, and I remember that.
And that was 3.
And I was it was spring, and I had turned 3 in December.
Oh, okay.
So
okay, well, let's get back to your PhD. And what were you studying at Catholic U?
That I took. There were 2 or 3 required things. For example, there was an English one required. You had to give 3 languages in that department.
So what were you majoring in? What was the major?
The 3 languages I gave them were going to be Russian, French, and German. And they looked kind of embarrassed. They said, "We don't have a Russian department."
Oh.
So they said, "Why don't you take English for your 3rd as a sort of a super credential that you are fluent in your own language, and thereby can translate well," which made sense.
That English,
so I did.
English or medieval English?
No, all of English. What it was, I wound up memorizing the 3-page syllabus because it was kind of a separation into categories of things, and the instructor was an old priest. And he took delight in just needling people. He was not terribly nice, but he probably turned out good scholars that way. But he warned us. Huh? He always said in papers, he said, "This is what I expect. And if you didn't do it, you suffered for it. If you did do it, you got an A." Yeah. So I memorized the syllabus, and sure enough, on the final exam, he gave a final exam. None of the other graduate people did. You had to talk to people and you had to turn things in. But yes, well, so I had the English final thing I did. I took the concept of time in American poetry, modern American poetry, which was really instructive. You think you know something about that, but it was fascinating.
Yeah.
And then I did things in German and in French as well. I took various courses, but mostly they were just 2 or 3 people and the teacher.
Yeah.
A couple of them were just me and the teacher.
Well, now you got your PhD in you say the 70s. Do you have a date for it?
80. I got it in 82.
82. What'd you do after that?
After that, I decided that I would look into some more literary translating, and I worked on a lot of things. And
For whom?
For whom? For me.
Just for yourself? Oh, okay.
Oh yeah, I was a freelance, as it were.
Okay.
And the 3 plays I translated were actually it was the person I had done my PhD thesis on, who was a German Jewish writer, born in 1869 and wound up in Israel eventually, but fascinating person, but led into all kinds of things like the literary movements, the Impressionists, and all the modernists, and the all kinds of, and this you find yourself branching into art and the multicultural or multicultural nature of each form of culture.
So you started developing an interest then, I presume, in so many of the different subjects that you've expanded on and exploring history. And
it's all there, and then history begins. I did take a history course in college, and of course it was mandatory to take 2 in high school. But I just found everything kept leading to what's it like and what happens and what's it develops, and it does. And when you get this old, if you're still playing around with it, things begin to fall into place. They begin to coalesce. You get a wonderful picture. You see more panoramas, say, of English history.
And we've got to discuss another subject, and that's the zither.
Oh, yes.
That's the zither, and you are the zither lady, right?
I was known as the zither lady for a long time.
Well,
then I was known as the medieval English. I ran some courses.
When did you first start playing the zither?
As a young adult. I wish it had been sooner because I was keyboard, from a child. But I first started, I was living in Germany, and I thought, gee, I had seen The Third Man. Oddly, I'd seen it in Japan, but I had seen The Third Man, and the sound of it got me. And I'd heard the sound now and again. You didn't hear it much. But here I was in Germany, and I thought, well, here I am, Germany and Austria at my disposal. Why don't I just get an instrument and take a couple of lessons so that I can play it? And that was wanton, hubris, or what you would call it, because you don't just take a couple of, it's very difficult to play.
A couple of lessons does you.
But I did find a teacher, and I did have her acquire an instrument for me. And I did have some lessons, and I realized right away, because you're doing 2 different things. You're doing different things with each hand. With your right hand, you're striking strings with a ring on your finger, and you're also playing accompaniment with these fingers. With your left hand, you're playing a melody on a fretboard. So it's a puzzle to solve, and you could just sheer repetition if you really want to stick at it, and you win through. And then a long time after, and I played in several different countries, and I made some recordings and all that. And then the phone rang one day, and somebody said, are you a zither teacher? And I said, well, no, but they said, could you teach me to play? And I said, all right. So eventually I had 7 students running at the same time. Now I just have 2, sort of 2.5.
But you've had a student almost constantly, right?
For a long time, yes.
Yeah. And the young lady that you have, she just is, I've enjoyed listening to, especially you've had them on the talent show, and that's
yes.
Well, Jane, I told you we'd talk a lot more about your activities here, and we're down to 2 minutes.
Ooh.
Can you believe it?
Time flies.
I don't know where it goes. But anyway, when you're having fun, yeah. But you've done so many things here, and you've been involved in the music, teaching the music, and continuously, and the exploring history has just been a major activity because everybody has enjoyed the programs you've had, and they've been so diverse, as I indicated.
And the hieroglyphics have helped.
The hieroglyphics.
Reading documents.
Where did you learn about hieroglyphics?
I taught myself. I started to teach myself.
Okay.
Because the Dell Publishing folks put out some original primers, learning books, reading books. And it was so interesting that I got a group together. We had 8 people beginning years ago, and we kind of slogged along together.
Yeah.
And I was barely a jump ahead of them, but 2 or 3 of them really took to it well. Yeah. Andy Benvenuto was one who took to it very well.
Oh, did he? Oh, yeah, I knew Andy quite well.
And we have some people now. We have Helen Aguero took to it very well, and some other folks in between. But then you work at it, and then you discover that you really can do something with it, and you get to the stage where you can recognize that a translation of a hieroglyphic thing may not be quite right.
But who knows?
Well, who knows it? But if you study it, and I think sometimes people, like the most famous name in the field is Budge, did not use their common sense a lot of the time. Yeah. They'd be in a military setting, but they wouldn't translate something in that. Obviously, you'd have a general leading or an officer leading an attack on something, and he'd be talking just in terms of as though they were walking up the hill looking for something. Yeah. But that's another thing. But the languages lead you.
Maybe we ought to have you back and we'll just talk about what you did here at Green Spring, because you've done so many things and you've got such a diverse background. It's interesting to talk with you in overall things because we're running out of time.